It's a strange thing, the way a single glance can split your world wide open, how the sight of your own reflection, sitting alone at a restaurant table while your husband laughs at another with his parents, can make you feel like a ghost at your own life. That moment, just before the soup arrived, when I reached for my glass of water and caught the emptiness in my eyes, was the one that changed everything for me. We were supposed to be celebrating. That's what I'd told myself when I first agreed to the trip, 5 days at a lakeside resort in Vermont, with his family who, over the past 3 years, had never made me feel like I truly belonged. But I had held on to the hope that maybe this time would be different. After all, we were sharing a cabin. We were going on hikes and boat rides and scenic dinners together. Surely, by now, they would see me as part of their family. I had married their son. I had stood beside him through job changes, the loss of his grandmother, even the miscarriage we never told them about. I had earned my place. At least I thought I had. That illusion cracked the moment we arrived and his mother, Patricia, pointed toward the back of the dining area with a casual flick of her hand and said, "Why don't you sit over there, dear? We've reserved this table for the family." For the family. Her tone was so smooth, so matter-of-fact, that I almost missed the sting tucked neatly behind the words. My husband, Brandon, didn't flinch. He just turned and kissed my cheek like this was completely normal. "Go ahead and grab a seat, babe. We'll be right over," he said, already drifting toward the long oak table with his parents, his sister, and her fiancé. I walked to the smaller table by the window, trying not to let my heels click too loudly on the wooden floor, as if my dignity were something I could preserve through silence. The waitress handed me a menu without a word, and I pretended to study it, though the letters looked like a blur of ink and shame. I glanced over once, just to see. They were laughing. To them, I was invisible. That night set the tone for the entire trip. Breakfast? They ate early without waking me. Lunch? Packed a picnic and forgot to mention it. Dinners? Always family style, at a big table where no chair was ever pulled out for me. I sat alone so many times that the servers started to give me that sympathetic look usually reserved for women stood up on dates. The silence from them wasn't even cold, it was indifferent. It was worse than hostility. It was like I didn't exist. Not even a question about how I slept, or if I wanted to join the nature walk, or if I needed anything from the store. And each time I turned to Brandon, searching for some sign of loyalty, some defense of my presence, I got nothing more than a shrug and that lazy, infuriating phrase, "It's just their way." Their way. As if exclusion was a charming family quirk, like using cloth napkins or playing board games after dinner. As if my isolation should be something I accepted with a grateful smile. By the third day, I had memorized the pattern. Wake up alone. Watch them drive off from the cabin window. Eat in silence. Wander. Wait. Wonder if anyone would notice if I disappeared. And in that lonely space, something inside me settled, not with resignation, but with clarity. It happened after dinner, which I ate at a local cafe by myself, seated between 2 elderly couples who seemed delighted by my presence. They talked to me more in 20 minutes than my in-laws had in 3 days. As I paid my bill and stepped back into the crisp evening air, I didn't feel hurt anymore. I felt certain. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask Brandon to stand up for me one more time. I simply smiled when he got back to the cabin and asked how my evening was, as if we were just roommates, loosely connected by rent and routine. That night, while he snored in the bed beside me, I reached for my phone and tapped my screen open. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need a scene. But I did need something. Something that reminded me I was still a woman with choices, with a spine, with enough dignity not to beg for a seat at a table that clearly didn't want me. The idea came easily. My best friend Lily always said that the best retaliation isn't loud or angry, it's silent and strategic. She was the one who helped me set it up, actually. One phone call, one confirmed reservation, and one instruction that would turn the next day on its head. I barely slept. But not from nerves. From anticipation. When Brandon finally stirred the next morning, I was already dressed, already packed and already sipping a cappuccino I had ordered from room service, not because I needed the caffeine, but because I deserved to start my day with something warm and rich and mine. "You're up early," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "We're doing the boat tour this morning, remember?" "Oh, I remember," I said, handing him a steaming cup I'd ordered for him too, though I didn't say a word about that. "But I've got something else planned for today." Before he could ask what, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. And then again. And again. A flurry of alerts. He picked it up, his brows knitting tighter with each message. "What the hell?" he muttered. "Something wrong?" I asked, keeping my tone light, sweet even. He didn't answer. He just stood there, reading, scrolling, and finally dialing his mother's number with a speed that told me panic had begun to settle in. I waited patiently, still sipping my cappuccino, while he paced the room. Because that was the moment they found out what I had done. And suddenly, the silence that had surrounded me for days shattered into chaos. The first sign that something had shifted was the way Brandon's voice cracked when he said his mother's name into the phone. I didn't need to hear both sides of the conversation to know that the woman who had spent the past 3 days pretending I didn't exist was now panicking because I had suddenly decided to make myself disappear. Not literally, of course. But in every way that mattered to her, I was gone, and the absence was inconvenient. He turned to me as if I had the answers to a test he never bothered to study for, his eyebrows drawn together in a mixture of confusion and indignation. "Claire," he said slowly, still clutching the phone like a lifeline, "what did you do?" It was fascinating, really, how quickly the shift came. For 3 days, no one had looked at me directly. No one had spoken to me unless it was to ask for an extra napkin or to pass the salt. But now that I had become the variable they couldn't control, they suddenly remembered I had a voice, a will, and perhaps most threatening of all, autonomy. I placed my cappuccino down gently on the saucer, taking my time, as if the question didn't warrant urgency. "I made other arrangements," I said, watching the confusion settle deeper into his face like sediment in still water. "I figured it would be better for everyone if I didn't impose on your family traditions." He blinked, clearly still trying to make sense of it, and then he did what he always did when backed into a corner. He laughed. It was that nervous, brittle kind of laugh that only showed up when he felt like something was slipping out of his grasp. "You're not making any sense," he said. "Mom just told me the hotel canceled our boat reservation. Not just ours, all of them. She said the lakefront brunch has been shut down, too. And the shuttle never showed up this morning." I smiled then, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because there was a strange kind of satisfaction in knowing they were finally on the receiving end of disruption. "Yes," I said, standing and smoothing out my blouse with deliberate care. "It turns out when you spend 3 days treating someone like a stranger, that stranger may start behaving like one." He stared at me, still waiting for some punchline, some version of events that would restore the balance of power to where it had been when we arrived. But the punchline never came. Only the truth. The truth was that the resort had been fully booked, except for a single private suite that overlooked the water and came with concierge privileges. I'd upgraded to it the moment I made my decision, explaining my situation to a lovely woman named Liana at the front desk who, after hearing just a fraction of the story, insisted on helping me salvage my vacation. It wasn't hard to make changes from there. The boat reservations had been made under my name, something his parents hadn't realized because I'd booked them weeks ago, foolishly believing I was planning a trip that would bring us closer. The same was true for the spa treatments, the brunch, and the transportation services. I had paid for everything. Every reservation, every scheduled amenity, every carefully organized detail they had treated like an entitlement had been arranged and purchased by me. And now I had canceled all of it. Brandon sat down on the edge of the bed, stunned into silence. That was new for him. He was always so quick with words, especially the kind that dismissed mine. But now, there was nothing for him to say that wouldn't make him look smaller than he already felt. Eventually, he whispered, "Why would you do this?" It was the first real question he'd asked me all week. Not about my day, or how I was feeling, or whether I felt included. Just this, Why, I had finally stopped asking for a seat at a table where I clearly wasn't welcome. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw not just the man I'd married, but the man he had slowly become. The man who mistook passivity for peace, who believed neutrality was a virtue when it was really just a comfortable form of betrayal. I had married him believing we were building something together, a marriage, a life, a sense of shared belonging. But the past few years had shown me, in ways both subtle and sharp, that his loyalty had limits. And those limits began the moment his mother made a face or his sister rolled her eyes. I did it, I said, keeping my voice steady, because I realized I'm the only one in this family who considers me family. And I'm tired of trying to belong somewhere I'm clearly not wanted. His phone buzzed again, more messages, probably from Patricia. I imagined her frantically pacing the hotel lobby, demanding explanations, pointing fingers, looking for someone to blame. Maybe she was demanding Brandon call me back to heal, expecting him to fix this by scolding me or charming me into compliance. But he didn't reach for the phone. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, face blank, as if finally understanding something he couldn't unsee. "I'm leaving," I said. "Not forever. Not yet. But for the rest of this trip, I'll be staying in my suite. Alone. Doing things I enjoy. Eating meals where I'm welcome. Taking up space like I deserve to. And if your family asks where I am, you can tell them whatever story you want. Because honestly, I no longer care what they think." I grabbed my weekend bag, already packed with a few carefully chosen outfits, and walked to the door. Before I left, I turned back to him, one last glance to see if the man I married was still in there somewhere. He looked up at me, eyes a little glassy. "You're serious?" "I've never been more," I said, stepping out into the hallway and letting the door close softly behind me. And that, as it turns out, was the moment the panic truly began. By the time I reached the main lodge, the sun had climbed just far enough above the horizon to cast a warm, golden light across the lake, turning the water into a mirror that reflected everything, except the unraveling happening just behind me. I could hear the distant rumble of an argument even before I reached the front steps, a chorus of voices tangled together in frustration. Patricia's sharp tones cut through the air like shards of glass, each syllable laced with disbelief and entitlement, as if the resort staff had personally insulted her by executing the exact instructions I had given them the night before. I paused just before entering, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as she paced in front of the concierge desk, gesturing wildly with one hand while holding her phone in the other. Her husband, Gerald, stood awkwardly beside her, trying to interject every few moments, but ultimately shrinking beneath her fury like a man who had long ago learned that silence was safer. Their daughter, Elise, was half-seated on the bench by the lobby fireplace, scrolling through her phone with a scowl so deep it looked almost permanent. She was muttering to her fiancé, Daniel, who clearly wished he had never agreed to come on this trip in the first place. None of them noticed me at first, which was honestly perfect. I stepped quietly inside and made my way toward the cafe that overlooked the lake. The hostess, a kind woman with bright eyes and an easy smile, greeted me like an old friend, her voice a welcome contrast to the chaos behind me. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale," she said, gesturing to the private corner table I'd requested when I upgraded. "Your table is ready. Shall I bring your usual cappuccino?" I smiled, nodding. "That would be lovely, thank you." The table was set with fresh flowers and a neatly folded linen napkin, and for the first time in 3 days, I didn't have to brace myself for exclusion or prepare an extra layer of politeness to make up for being unwanted. I simply sat, accepted the menu, and looked out at the view. A small part of me wondered whether this piece might feel hollow without someone to share it with, but the truth was, the silence was soothing in a way I hadn't expected. Meanwhile, just beyond the glass doors, the temperature in the lobby was rising metaphorically, if not literally. I caught snippets of Patricia's tirade as she marched up to the desk again, demanding to speak to a manager, even though the calm young man behind the counter had patiently explained, more than once, that everything had been reserved and subsequently canceled. by someone with the proper booking credentials. I don't care what your system says, Patricia snapped, her voice gaining volume with each sentence. We were promised a private brunch on the lake, followed by the boat tour. We made these plans months ago. The concierge, whom I recognized from check-in, remained unflinchingly polite. Yes, ma'am, the original reservations were made under a guest's name, but they were canceled late last night by that same guest. All services have been reallocated. To whom? She demanded, slamming her manicured hand against the desk. The concierge offered a calm smile. To another guest who upgraded to our platinum tier suite package. That's when it happened. The precise moment Patricia turned her head, caught sight of me through the cafe windows and froze. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if her brain needed an extra second to process the information. I didn't wave. I didn't smirk. I simply lifted my cappuccino in a quiet toast and returned to my menu, as if she were any other guest. As if her opinion no longer mattered to me in the slightest. A minute later, I saw Brandon arrive, his posture tense and his face lined with a fatigue that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He walked directly to his mother, who immediately pulled him into the storm of her outrage. I couldn't hear the words, but the gestures said enough. She was livid, pointing toward me, then back at the concierge, then waving her phone around like it was a sword she intended to use. Brandon looked toward me briefly, then away, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I wondered what he would do. Defend me? Appease her? Try to walk the tightrope that had defined our marriage for far too long? Instead, he sank down into the bench beside Elise and ran both hands through his hair. No one looked more defeated than a man forced to choose between the life he'd built and the comfort of never challenging his family. When my breakfast arrived, warm croissants, fresh fruit, and eggs exactly the way I liked them, I savored every bite like it was an act of reclamation. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone. I didn't look back at the family I had temporarily left in disarray. They had dismissed me for 3 days without a second thought. Surely, they could handle a few more hours without my presence. Half an hour later, Patricia approached my table, flanked by Gerald and Elise, though neither of them looked particularly enthusiastic about the confrontation. I didn't stand. I didn't offer to pull up a chair. I simply folded my napkin and looked up at her as she stopped in front of me. You canceled our itinerary, she said, her voice low but sharp. I nodded. I did. Why would you do something like that? I met her eyes then, not with anger, but with something much quieter and far more unsettling. Because I was invisible until I disrupted your comfort. Now, you're finally speaking to me. She opened her mouth to retort, but I raised a hand gently. You don't have to apologize. I'm not expecting you to. I just want you to understand that I'm no longer playing along. I booked this trip. I paid for everything. And I watched silently while you all decided I didn't matter. So I made a different decision. Gerald shifted awkwardly beside her, clearing his throat, but said nothing. Elise glanced away, uncomfortable in a way I doubted she often felt. You've embarrassed us, Patricia said finally. I laughed, just once, soft and without bitterness. You've embarrassed yourselves. I simply gave you the privacy to realize it. And with that, I turned back to my breakfast, giving them the gift of dismissal, the very one they'd handed me so many times before. By the time I finished breakfast, the tension that had clung to my shoulders like a damp coat began to slide away. It didn't disappear all at once, of course, that kind of unraveling never happens overnight. But there was something undeniably healing about choosing my own seat at my own table and enjoying a meal that no one else had prepared with side orders of judgment and condescension. After Patricia and her entourage retreated from my table, they returned to their corner of the resort like a group of travelers who'd been given the wrong map. From where I sat, I could see them huddled in the main lounge, whispering among themselves, heads tilted in my direction every few moments. It would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. The panic, the discomfort, the attempts to spin a new narrative where they were the wronged party, it was all as familiar as their forced smiles and brittle compliments from years of family gatherings past. Still, I didn't let myself dwell there. Not anymore. Instead, I stood slowly from my seat, thanked the hostess with a warmth I'd forgotten I was still capable of, and walked outside into the cool, pine-scented air. The lake glittered in the morning light, its surface so smooth it looked like brushed silk. I had forgotten how good it felt to breathe in air that didn't carry the weight of unsaid things. I walked for a long time, longer than I'd intended, losing track of how many winding trails I followed or how many birds I heard calling from somewhere just beyond the trees. It was the first time in a very long time that I was alone without being lonely. When I returned to my suite, I found a note slid under the door, folded precisely and written in Brandon's handwriting. For a moment, I just stared at it, unsure whether I wanted to open it or set it on fire. Eventually, I chose neither. I placed it on the desk and let it sit unopened, like a fragile object I wasn't yet ready to touch. Instead, I changed into the blue linen sundress I'd packed but never worn, the one that always made me feel like I belonged in my own skin. I slipped on a pair of sandals, grabbed my book and a straw hat, and headed to the spa. If the rest of the family wanted to spin in circles, chasing answers for a mess they'd made, they were free to do so without me. The spa was a sanctuary, all quiet corridors and calming scents. The woman at the desk greeted me by name, smiling as she handed me a soft robe and directed me to the eucalyptus steam room, where I spent a blissful half-hour thinking about absolutely nothing. Not Patricia. Not Elise. Not even Brandon. I simply let the heat melt the last few days off my skin, like armor I no longer needed. Afterward, I treated myself to a massage so good I nearly wept. My therapist, a gentle woman named Sophia, didn't ask any questions, didn't try to make small talk. She simply worked in silence, her hands firm and kind, coaxing away knots I hadn't realized I carried in my shoulders, my back, the arches of my feet. The deeper she worked, the clearer my thoughts became, as if she were pressing clarity straight into my spine. I left the spa glowing, not just from the facial I hadn't planned on, but from the realization that I had been slowly disappearing in that marriage. Not through violence or drama, but in the way women so often do. I had made myself smaller to fit into spaces that were never built with me in mind. I had bitten my tongue to preserve peace. I had excused slights with grace that only benefited the people slinging them. And most painfully, I had let Brandon drift so far from me that I hardly recognized him anymore. Back in my suite, I finally picked up the letter. The envelope had a crease in it, like it had been folded and refolded several times before he slid it under the door. I opened it carefully, expecting an apology. Instead, it was an explanation, or at least his attempt at one. I didn't know what to say this morning. I still don't know what to say now. You looked at me like you didn't recognize me, and the truth is, maybe you don't. I haven't been the husband you deserve, and I've let my silence say things I never had the courage to admit out loud. I know what you did this morning wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming something that should have never been taken from you. I want to fix this. I don't know how, but I want to try. If you're willing to talk, I'll be at the dock at sunset. No pressure. Just you and me. I stared at the letter for a long time, letting the words wash over me, not just reading them, but trying to feel them. Part of me wanted to laugh at the predictability of it all. The man waits until things fall apart to realize what he's allowed to rot. But another part of me, the part that still remembered our early days, when love felt like a shared language instead of a foreign one, softened just slightly. I folded the letter and placed it in my bag without deciding yet. I didn't owe him a response. Not yet, but I wasn't ready to shut the door entirely either. Not because I wanted him back, but because I wanted to know if he was willing to meet me where I now stood, not where I had once spent to accommodate him. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of deliberate self-care, long baths, room service, music from my favorite playlist echoing through the suite as I let myself feel rooted again. It was incredible how much a woman could rebuild in a single day when she stopped asking for permission to be whole. And as the sky began to shift into that pink-orange softness of early evening, I slipped the letter back out of my bag, read it one more time, and stood by the window looking down toward the dock. By the time I reached the edge of the dock, The sun was lowering itself gently behind the tree-lined hills across the lake, casting long streaks of amber light across the water. The whole scene shimmered with that soft, cinematic kind of beauty that always seems to arrive just when your heart is too full to carry anymore. I stood at the start of the wooden planks for a long moment, not quite ready to step forward, wondering if he had come early or if he'd changed his mind altogether. Then I saw him. Brandon was sitting on one of the benches at the end of the dock, his elbows resting on his knees, the fingers of one hand drumming a restless rhythm against his chin. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in spirit, like someone who had spent the last several hours doing the kind of internal inventory that leaves you a little hollow and a lot humbled. I walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to arrive on my own terms. I wasn't walking into an apology so much as I was walking into a reckoning. One that would either mark the beginning of something better or the end of something that had quietly expired long before either of us had noticed. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, standing quickly, his eyes scanning my face for something I wasn't sure he would find. "You came," he said, as if that alone was a kind of miracle. "I did," I replied, my voice calm, but without any promise attached to it. We stood in silence for a moment, the lake gently lapping against the wooden slats below us, the wind carrying the faint scent of pine and something sweeter, maybe honeysuckle from the nearby trail, or maybe just the possibility of change. Brandon gestured to the bench beside him. "Do you want to sit?" I did, eventually, but not yet. Not before I said what I had come to say, before I let my truth stretch its legs for once. "I need you to hear me," I began, my gaze steady. "Not defend yourself. Not smooth things over. Not try to explain away 3 days of being invisible while standing right beside me. I need you to really hear me." He nodded, his posture softening. "Okay. When we got married, I knew your family wasn't going to roll out a red carpet for me," I said. "They made it clear from the start that I wasn't what they expected, or maybe not what they wanted. I was too independent, too outspoken, too unwilling to play the kind of polite daughter-in-law who just smiles and pours coffee and lets the condescension slide." He opened his mouth slightly, but I lifted my hand, stopping him gently. "I'm not blaming them for being who they are, but I am holding you accountable for pretending not to see it. For 3 years, Brandon, I've watched you laugh along with them at jokes that landed on my back. I've watched you shrug off their coldness like it was weather instead of a pattern. And this trip, this ridiculous, isolating, humiliating trip, was just the latest in a long string of moments where you decided it was easier to let me carry the discomfort alone." The words hung there between us like clothes drying on a line, exposed, undeniable, and deeply personal. He looked down at his hands, fingers interlaced, jaw tight. "I don't have an excuse," he said quietly. "And I don't think I deserve forgiveness just because I finally woke up." I sat then, not because I was offering him grace, but because I wanted him to see that I could take a seat without asking anymore. "I think I spent a long time trying to be liked by them," I said. "And even longer hoping that you would be the bridge between us, that you'd say something when they crossed a line. But what I learned this week is that I don't need a bridge to people who built a fortress. And I don't need a translator for someone who refuses to listen." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. "Claire, I thought keeping the peace meant not choosing sides. I thought staying neutral would somehow help us all get along. But I see now that neutrality isn't noble when someone's being hurt. It's just cowardice dressed up as courtesy." That surprised me, not just the clarity, but the fact that it came from him. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the wind speak for a moment, filling the space with the rustling of trees and the soft creak of the dock beneath us. "I canceled everything," I said after a pause. "The boat tour, the brunch, the spa day, the shuttle. I did it because I wanted them to feel, for one day, the inconvenience of exclusion. And because I wanted you to feel what it's like when I finally stop shrinking." He nodded. "I did. And it gutted me." I let that hang in the air. Sometimes guilt is the only honest response left when words have lost their charm. "I don't know what comes next," I told him. "I'm not sure if we can rebuild from this or if we were just really good at pretending for a while. But I do know that if I ever go back to that house you call home, it won't be as the girl trying to earn her seat at the table. It will be as a woman who brings her own chair and a guest list. He smiled then, a real one, small but genuine. I would sit at that table, if you'd have me. I looked out at the water again, then back at him. You'd have to earn that seat. Just like I've spent years trying to earn mine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the kind that makes your breath hitch because of what it usually contains. But when he opened it, it wasn't a ring. It was a delicate gold necklace, with a tiny charm shaped like a compass. I bought this before the trip, he said. I plan to give it to you at the lake brunch. I thought it would be poetic, new directions, shared adventures. But then I lost the map. I took the box gently and held the necklace in my palm. The charm sparkled in the fading light, and I traced its edge with my thumb, not deciding anything yet, but not closing the box either. I guess we'll see, I said. Which direction we go. And as the sun sank into the hills, I didn't move closer, and I didn't pull away. I just sat beside him, quiet and steady, on a dock that no longer belonged to anyone but me. By the time the sun had fully disappeared beyond the hills, casting the lake in a deep wash of purple and gray, I could feel something inside me shift, not loudly, not with fire or fanfare, but with the quiet finality of a door being gently closed after years of creaking on its hinges. I didn't tell Brandon to walk me back. I didn't reach for his hand or invite him to share the silence. I simply stood up, slipped the small compass necklace into the pocket of my cardigan, and walked the length of the dock alone, each step as deliberate and unhurried as a woman who had finally made peace with her own direction. Back in my suite, I peeled off the day slowly. The linen dress, now carrying the faint scent of lake air. The sandals, with bits of gravel still clinging to the soles. I washed my face and sat cross-legged on the wide window seat overlooking the water, watching the stars appear one by one, as if even the sky was practicing how to show up for itself again. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was restless, but because my thoughts were too full. I kept replaying every moment of that conversation on the dock, not in search of mismeanings or subtext, but simply to hear my own voice speaking with such clarity and conviction. It had been years since I'd heard myself sound like that. Not since before the wedding. Not since before the slow erosion of boundaries that had worn me down into the shape of a woman who smiled through being overlooked. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. No alarms. No voices in the hallway. Just the soft glow of early light filtering through the curtains, painting everything in a gentle promise. I made myself tea instead of coffee and sat again by the window, wrapping the hotel's thick blanket around my shoulders like a shield. I didn't expect anyone to knock. So when the knock came, tentative, barely louder than the whisper of wind against the glass, I waited a moment before standing. I opened the door slowly, finding Elise standing there, hands clasped tightly in front of her, wearing the expression of someone who had never had to ask for forgiveness and wasn't quite sure how. "Hi," she said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Do you have a minute?" I didn't smile, but I didn't close the door either. "Sure." She stepped inside cautiously, as if the room itself might reject her. I gestured toward the armchair across from mine, and she sank into it, legs crossed at the ankles, back straight, but no longer rigid. "I wanted to say something," she began, then faltered, fidgeting with the sleeve of her cardigan. "Actually, no, I needed to say something." I waited. Silence had taught me patience. "This trip didn't go the way anyone planned," she said. "But the truth is, I think it went exactly the way it needed to. At least for me." I tilted my head slightly, curious. Not moved, but open. "I watched you, Claire," she continued. "For days, sitting alone, staying quiet, not reacting. And I told myself it was just how you were, aloof, distant, cold. That's what Mom always said, you know. That you didn't want to be part of the family." I gave a quiet laugh at that, dry and unamused. Of course she did. Elise looked embarrassed. "But I see it now. You weren't being cold. You were being shut out. We all played a part in it, even me." And I think I needed to see you finally take up space to realize how much I'd been complicit in keeping you small. That landed differently. Not like a performance. Not like a guilt offering. But like someone who had started to dust off a mirror they'd avoided for too long. I don't expect you to forgive us, she added. Honestly, I'm not sure I would, if I were you. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. And that if things are going to change, it has to start with someone owning what we've done. I studied her face then. Not for cracks or deception, but for sincerity. And I found it not polished, not perfect, but present. I appreciate that, I said, my voice measured but warm. I really do. But this can't just be a moment. It has to be a pattern. She nodded. I know. And I'm not asking for anything. Just, maybe one day we could have coffee. You and me. As people, not as in-laws. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the lake where a mist had begun to gather, soft and silver. I think I'd like that, I said finally, not turning around. But not today. When she left, I felt something new settle in my chest, not relief, not triumph, but a kind of groundedness I hadn't felt in years. The kind that comes when someone finally sees you, not because you begged to be noticed, but because you made them stop and look. Later that afternoon, Brandon helped me load my suitcase into the trunk of the rental car. He didn't ask for a verdict. He didn't try to spin the story in his favor. He simply handed me a travel mug of tea and said, "Wherever you go from here, I hope you keep walking like you did on that dock." I looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "Maybe I will. And maybe you'll find your own pace too." He nodded, stepping back, letting me close the trunk myself. It felt symbolic somehow, that small detail. I didn't cry when I pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I just drove, windows down, music playing softly, the compass charm now around my neck, resting just above my collarbone. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet. But I knew, with every mile between me and that resort, that I was finally on my way to myself.